And that's where that own your 10% concept comes in. Control what you can control and let go of what you can't. Then you get to strategize. Once people regain a little bit of clarity, they begin asking different questions. Instead of how do I fix everything, it becomes what's the next best step?
Hello there, and welcome to today's episode of the Easy EdTech Podcast. My name is Monica Burns, and I am so glad that you're here to join me today. If you want to make the most of education technology, aka EdTech, well, you are in the right place. My goal has always been to help make EdTech easier and give you ideas you can try yourself, share with a colleague, or bookmark for later in the school year. Every Tuesday here on the Easy EdTech Podcast, you'll hear stories from my time in the classroom, the work I do now with schools and districts, and my travels to different EdTech events. Get ready for solo episodes where I share some quick tips and stories, and interviews full of practical ideas and stories from new guests each month. If we mention something you'd like to check out, make sure to click the link. You'll find it in the episode description or the summary area where you're listening to this podcast, or you can find every episode and all of the resources we mention by going to classtechtips.com/podcast, or by going to classtechtips.com and just clicking on the Easy EdTech Podcast button at the top of the page. This episode is sponsored by Polsey. You can host live polls and quizzes for your classroom with the help of AI. The AI behind most polling tools can't access the internet, but Polsey can. Say you teach 10th grade geography. Ask Polsey for a 10-question quiz on plate tectonics. Polsey researches the topic, then builds a live quiz in under 30 seconds. Students answer from any browser. No downloads needed. Use code ClassTechTips to get your first 2 months free. Sign up at polsey.co. That's POLLZY.co. This week's episode is titled How AI Can Support Educator Wellness and Emotional Intelligence. And I'm excited today to chat with Sheila Dokken, who I connected with as part of a presentation I gave to a group I connected with on LinkedIn, all about AI in education. She reached out after I gave this kind of webinar, fireside chat, a mini presentation to the group, and we were chatting. She shared her new book, and I thought her perspective on emotional intelligence and artificial intelligence would be perfect for the podcast. She serves as a coordinator of prevention and safety for a big district in Minnesota, where she works across more than a dozen schools on everything from student support and crisis response to restorative practices and educator wellness. So we're going to talk today about her new book, Hey AI, I'm Tired, and how it explores what happens when you might just feel exhausted and you also have access to technology, and how we can stay human with all of the big shifts happening inside of education technology, including AI. Let's get into the conversation. Welcome to the podcast. I am so excited to talk to you today about a big topic, not just AI, but emotional intelligence, right, in this age of AI. But before we get into all that, can you share with listeners, what is your role in education? What does your day-to-day look like?
Of course. My name is Sheila Dokken. I serve as a coordinator of prevention and safety for a large district in Minnesota. And I work on everything from student support, educator wellness, school culture, restorative practices, crisis response, systems level prevention, really across 18 schools. And I found my niche at the intersection of educator wellness, emotional intelligence, system change, behavior adoption, and AI integration. And actually, before I went into education, I was an employment attorney for about 20 years. So I was managing entirely different types of behavior that I see in education. But really, truly, what we look for when we're talking about behavior these days is impacting adults in very challenging ways. Yeah. And unfortunately, adults are taking the brunt of it. And one of the biggest gaps that we see, especially in education, is we expect our adults to model emotional regulation, resilience, communication, coping skills, but we're never really teaching them or supporting the skills in the adults themselves. And we know many of our adults, they're operating in survival mode today, and they need help. And one of the reasons I care so deeply about emotional intelligence and adult wellness is that adult capacity influences everything. And so in my role, no 2 days look the same. I'm supporting school leaders with complex behavior, crisis situations. Other days, I'm designing professional development, working on district-wide prevention systems, and supporting all of those practices that I talked about. But a huge part of my work is centered on human behavior and what helps people function under pressure. And that's kind of what led me into the AI space as well, is I started to realize AI is not just about technology, it's about the human beings behind it. And how we're asking people to absorb and adopt all this technology, but giving them very little time to process and integrate it. And so that's where a lot of the work came from that led to this book.
Yeah. And just, that mission that you have for supporting educators, because we know it helps them better reach and better support students, right, is so crucial. I know so much of what I do around, right, curating resources or helping prepare people to, jump into these spaces, right, might be teacher focused on the surface level, but it's just like you said, right, we know that all that impacts the work that happens with students. And your new book, Hey AI, I'm Tired, right, takes a really different approach to AI and education than what we've talked about with other guests here on the podcast. And instead of focusing on lesson planning or student activities, which of course is a part, right, of maybe using AI behind the scenes as an educator, you're looking at how AI can support educator well-being. So what inspired you to write a book at this, different kind of intersection of AI and stress management?
Yes, I think one of the biggest things I was noticing in education is we are approaching a tipping point emotionally. At first, I was seeing a lot of exhaustion, but I have been recognizing something far deeper than that. It's frustration, it's discouragement, and in many cases, it's anger, where people don't feel like the system cares about them or that they're being seen. And we're always asking educators to take on more, learn something new, absorb more emotionally, physically, cognitively, behaviorally. And all the while we're expecting them to adapt to new expectations, new initiatives, new technologies, increasing student needs. And we sometimes just hand people a tool and say, here's a 45-minute training, you run with it. And we expect things to change. It just doesn't. And that's why I think the AI conversation was hitting me differently. Everybody's talking about, like what you said, efficiency, productivity.
Yeah.
But I kept thinking, people really don't need another system demanding more output. They need support. They need clarity. They need space, right, to think again. And so that's when I started thinking about the possibility that AI could serve a different role, not just as that productivity type of engine, but a tool that helps reduce that cognitive overload, helps support emotional well-being, but it has to be used intentionally. And that really became the heart of Hey AI, I'm Tired. It's not a book about technology. It's a book about what happens when exhausted human beings actually collide with technology and how we stay human within it. So it combines emotional intelligence, neuroscience, reflective AI prompts, practical processing exercises, and also introduces the PRISM framework to help people move from overwhelm to clarity and intention. So I wanted it to feel really practical, approachable, not just theoretical. So I really put these guided prompts, some brain space explorations, some stress and reactivity exercises, worksheets. It allows people to process more thoroughly, not just practicing it on AI itself, but also just having that reflection time. And ultimately, that goal is just to help people become more self-aware, more emotionally grounded, and intentional while living and working in this rapidly changing world. And we know in education, they have no time. They don't have time to run out and find a friend and say, I need help. It gives them a tool to use in the moment. And that's why and where the book came from.
And just that idea of cognitive overload, like you mentioned, I mean, oftentimes when I talk to educators about, what these different types of technology might do for them, right? Some of it is like saving that brain capital. Like you are
Mhm.
already like, I know for me, like I get reach the end of the day and I say, this is going to take me twice as long if I try it now, or it'll take me half as much time, right? If I do it tomorrow morning. Like, what's the best use of my time here? Because I'm just at capacity for trying to,
Yes.
right, solve a problem, answer a tricky email, right? Whatever it might be. And so I really appreciate that kind of acknowledgement to say, you might be as an educator feeling full, all right? Here's something that you might, want to take into consideration. So you alluded to the PRISM framework that you
Yes.
introduce in the book. Can you walk listeners through what that looks like in practice for an educator who's feeling overwhelmed or, stuck in a reactive pattern?
Of course. So, yes, it is all about interrupting those reactive cycles and into more intentional feelings. So, when I think about PRISM, it stands for pause, reflect, identify, strategize, and move.
Mhm.
What I found is when people are overwhelmed, they often skip directly from that stress to reaction, and there's no space in between. And that's when we get ourselves into trouble.
Yeah.
And when that consistently happens over time, people start living in this near state constant state of reactivity.
Yeah.
They become shorter emotionally. They become more
Mhm.
easily triggered, more mentally scattered, and they respond from that survival mode versus purpose and intention. And so sometimes that might look like going home at night and snapping at your kids because you've held it together all day.
Right.
Other times it might look like you sent that email to that parent and you got yourself into trouble because you didn't pause before you
Mhm.
responded. It
Mhm.
might mean you're shutting down or jumping to worst case scenario or just feeling like you kind of said mentally paralyzed because
Yeah.
everything feels urgent all at once. And what we know that does is leads to burnout.
Yeah.
And let's say this parent or educator has a parent email that's pretty difficult. There's escalating student behaviors. You have all these competing priorities. The nervous system is activated.
Mhm.
Your brain is going into that survival mode. So, first instinct is usually fix it, solve it, react,
Right.
defend, push harder,
Mhm.
right? But the first step in PRISM is not that. It's pause, not solve it, not fix it, but pause. And most people are aware of that wonderful Viktor Frankl quote that says, between stimulus and response, there's space. And in that space is the power to choose our response. And
Mhm.
PRISM is really about helping people reclaim that space again for themselves. Because even when we create just a tiny amount of space between stimulus and response, we begin moving out of that automatic reaction and back into our thinking brain. So
Mhm.
then the second step is about reflecting. This is where we slow down. What's happening inside of me? Not just externally, but internally.
Yeah.
What emotions am I feeling? What am I telling myself? Am I reacting to what's happening or am I reacting to another stressor or something that's been building inside of me for weeks or maybe even months?
Mhm.
And so reflection matters because overwhelmed people lose self awareness and they are unable to kind of focus on what they need in the moment. They're so focused on managing everybody else's needs, they stop noticing what they need. So then we get to identify. I think this is one of the most powerful and critical parts of the framework because it helps people separate what's controllable from what's not controllable.
Mhm.
And that is the key. When people are overwhelmed, everything starts to feel urgent, equally personal. But not everything is belonging to us. So we have to ask ourselves, what is actually mine? What am I supposed to focus on? What assumptions might I be making? What part of the situation can I influence? And that's where that own your 10% concept
Yeah.
comes in.
Mhm.
Control what you can control and let go of what you can't. Then you get to strategize. Once people regain a little bit of clarity, they begin asking different questions. Instead of how do I fix everything, it becomes what's the next best step? And strategize is about moving out of that emotional chaos and into
Mhm.
that intentional problem solving. Sometimes it means having a difficult conversation. Sometimes it means setting a boundary.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's asking for help. You just don't know what it is unless you take that moment to think about it. And then finally, there's move. And that's that intentional action, not reactive, not emotionally based, not because you're just in that moment, but it's intentional, aligned with your values and goals and clarity. Because when we think about emotional intelligence, It's not about not feeling stress. Of course, we're going to feel stressed. That's part of life. But it's about learning to manage and respond to it in healthier, more intentional ways that's sustainable over a long period of time. And so when people are looking at AI, it can actually support each stage of that process when we use it thoughtfully. It's not about replacing human judgment, but it helps us externalize our thoughts. It helps us organize our emotions, reduce that cognitive overload. Sometimes I like to think about it like Tom Riddle's diary from Harry Potter, except you get kind, supportive, and helpful responses.
Right. I love that comparison.
Yes.
Right. And just
so that's PRISM.
Yeah. Right. Just this idea, and thank you for taking us through the framework, right? That you might be able to leverage these newer, types of technology to help, to help connect back to something we've been dealing with for quite some time, right? Before, right, the AI as we know it and use it and explore it today, right, even came on the scene. So you mentioned a bit about this idea of owning your 10%, right? Yeah. Focusing energy on what you can actually control. What are some ways an educator might use AI as a thinking partner to identify and focus on that 10%?
When I think about own your 10%, it's what I've always come back to is resilience grows when you stop spending energy fighting the 90% you can't control and intentionally owning the 10% you can. So EI and emotional intelligence, it's not about controlling every emotion or navigating life perfectly. It's about developing awareness, regulation, and intentionality. So it allows us to respond to situations that are maybe out of our control or are not very perfect, don't have the exact perfect response. So one of the biggest shifts happens when educators stop using AI just as a productivity tool and start using it as a reflection tool. And this is not just limited to education. I think education just happens to be an audience I know very well. And I know it's a high stress environment where they don't have the time to reach out to others for support. So, for example, somebody who is dealing with a situation that's stressful or difficult, they could cut and paste that situation in and ask, help me separate what I can control from what I can't control. Or help me identify what assumptions I might be making right now and where I might be getting it wrong. Or even help me write an email that I can send without getting fired.
Yeah.
And honestly, there's just a lot of emotional intelligence in that pause alone.
Right.
Because sometimes, when we get overwhelmed, our thinking becomes tangled. Everything becomes urgent. Our personal, our emotional lives are all intermingled. So AI can help externalize those thoughts where people can step back, see situations a little bit more objectively instead of staying stuck. I like to think about it like a thought partner that you have always sitting next to you. And it's not to say you should replace it with a human connection.
Of course, right.
Obviously not. But when we're in the classroom, we can barely get time to go to the bathroom for 5 minutes, let alone go and find that person to connect to. So it's like having that journal that's talking back to you. You're no longer carrying it all in alone. You have someone you could put it out in the world to. And that's where the own your 10% idea becomes such a huge piece of this work. It's about reclaiming your agency. Sometimes we feel like we have no power or control, especially in systems like education, where everything is just so far beyond our control. And educators feel so buried under problems that they can't fully solve their own. And what we know are these situations are just escalating every day. I just talked to a counselor. She's had a 5th grader in her room every day this year, threatening suicide, engaging in huge behaviors. She's exhausted. And she understands mental health. Think about teachers who don't. And that student is still in their classroom all day long. And so what we know is we can't control student trauma. We can't control a system that might not seem to care. We can't control staffing shortages. We can't control the politics. We can't control the pace of technology. But we can control our response, our mindset, our communication, our boundaries, our emotional regulation, that next decision that we make. And when we stop mentally fighting that 90% that we can't control, our energy really is directed to the 10% that we can. And that's a real powerful shift psychologically. It's not about toxic positivity or pretending that hard things aren't there. It's about reconnecting people to their agency even inside of very difficult realities.
Yeah.
And that's where emotional intelligence and AI intersect in a very powerful way.
Yeah.
AI can help us slow down. It can help us process. It can challenge our assumptions and move us from that emotional mess in our minds to that more intentional thinking.
Yeah. No, and I just love that framing and that reminder about, removing the toxic positivity from this, right? I think it's so important for people. And, that concept of what can I control, right? And how can you help guide me, right? Through that, right? When you're leaning into a tool and that journal example, right? Just the idea. And I taught in an environment that was, very supportive colleagues, the teacher colleagues, right? Like I could have run down the hall and asked for help. And there's plenty of times I did, right? Cried to someone about a situation. But, that's not always the case for everyone.
Right.
It wasn't always the case for me when you think about, how the time of day and when you're going to get to. So just that idea that there might be, right, that prompt or what in this situation can I control, right? What is a good next step here? And just that exercise, like if this is someone's way of taking a deep breath and pausing before reacting because they can kind of, get it out. In the past for me, I'd like, let me just write this out in the notes in my phone and not hit send, right? Like that might be my pause response, when having a tough day. So I really love those connections. And, for someone who might be skeptical about turning to AI during a moment where they're stressed or, there's decision fatigue, what would you say to them to help them, see how this is different from just adding another tab to their browser or another tool to their plate?
And I completely understand skepticism about this process because educators have so much on their plates as it is. And AI is another thing that they're having to navigate right now.
Yeah.
So what I would say is the goal isn't to become dependent on AI. The goal is to help reduce some of those extra things that are swirling in your mind, right? That cognitive overload so you can think more clearly. And I think that's a really important distinction. I'm not talking about AI as a tool to make you produce more, work harder, optimize yourselves.
Right.
That obviously is going to have a role because we will be talking about that in education as a productivity tool.
Yeah.
My purpose is to talk about it as something more, a different way of looking at it that is about you as a human being. It's not about you as a teacher. It's about what you need in the moment. It's that reflective thought partner, a space to process, a space to organize your thoughts, to help step back when you're feeling overwhelmed. And we know we get there. When we get overwhelmed, it happens in the moment. We don't have a lot of time to think about it. But what we often have is our computer sitting in front of us.
Yeah.
And it can help us get there quickly. So we know our educators are moving from situation to situation, behavior to behavior all day long. And they're absorbing so much emotional intensity, all the stuff that goes with caring about these kiddos. And they need that place to just externalize a little bit. And so it's a different role than what I think they originally imagined with AI. It's not about productivity, it's about them. We need times to slow down our thinking. Help organize what we're thinking, especially when we're in the middle of chaos. And so AI can give it to us. And I think it's something too that I almost think we should start here as an education system. Encourage educators to use it this way first before we start shoving productivity. Here, use it to create your lesson plans, use it to do this, use it to do that. Start here because then they're going to have a personal vested interest in how it works before we get to all of the other stuff that's good for the school.
Right.
So AI is here. We're not going to change that. It's not going anywhere. The question is not whether or not you're going to interact with it. It's going to be how you're going to interact with it. Are you going to use it intentionally in ways that support you as a person instead of just for your own productivity? And when we use it for that human piece, that human-centered piece, that's when we grow. And that's when it's going to help us avoid burnout and all of those things that can happen in this very tough occupation.
Yeah, and just that entry point that you're giving someone permission to take, right? Like it may
Yes.
be, right, that at some point down the line, you are leveraging these tools for more, productivity, right? I know sometimes when I do a workshop, say like, let's start with something silly, right? Like let's
Yeah.
like that, might be the entry point originally, right? And now you're using
Mhm.
this to make recipes, right, at home or whatever it might
Yes.
be, right? But this is another way to think about, what is your entry point, what is your way, right, to exploring these tools and building some capacity, right, for the other use cases that you might be
Mhm.
asked to, interact with this tool for down the line. So, Sheila, this has been such an informative conversation, right? Really wonderful for educators to connect, right? Two big topics,
Yes.
emotional intelligence and then the AI of it all. We talked a little bit about your book, but where can people connect with you? Where can they follow along? Where can they learn more about your work?
Yes. They can connect with me through my website, which is www.sheiladokken.com. I'm very active on my LinkedIn page where I talk a lot about emotional intelligence,
Mhm.
educator wellness, AI integration, and behavior change, because it's really got to boil down to how we are encouraging full behavior adoption. That's the way it's going to have the most impact. And of course, the book, Hey AI, I'm Tired, is available online as well. It is in a workbook format, so it's large pages where you can write down your notes and add your own reflections to what you've learned. So reach out to me, friend request me on LinkedIn, anything you'd like to do.
Perfect. And we'll put all the links to all those things in the show notes. So anyone who's listening today and wants to come back and follow along and knows exactly where to go. So thank you so
Awesome.
much for your time, your energy, and your strategies today.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was great talking with you.
It was so much fun chatting with Sheila Dokken today. And I know you're going to want to follow along with her work and her book, but I want to finish up first, like we always do, with a few key points from today's conversation. Consider using AI as a reflection tool for processing stress, not just as a productivity engine. Try the PRISM framework: pause, reflect, identify, strategize, move, to interrupt reactive cycles and respond with intention. Give yourself permission to pause before reacting, even if that pause is typing a thought into a chatbot instead of hitting send. Focus your energy on the 10% you can control and let go of the 90% you cannot. Remember, you can find the show notes and the full list of resources from this episode, including all of the ways to connect with Sheila, by heading over to easyedtechpodcast.com. This one is episode 377, and you'll find all the links to it below the summary or description if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts too. Thank you to Polsey for sponsoring this episode. Polsey has live classroom polling using AI that researches your topic before writing the questions. Sign up at polsey.co with code ClassTechTips for 2 months free. Thank you for listening to this new episode of the Easy EdTech podcast. I love creating new episodes for you each week, but I could use a bit of help spreading the word about the podcast. Can you leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app? Spotify will let you tap on the stars, and Apple Podcasts will let you tap on the stars and leave a 1 or 2 sentence review. Thank you so much for taking this extra step. It helps other educators find episodes like this one when they're searching for EdTech tips.